Welcome to Reforming Slavics. Today, I'm Nick, and
I'm Tom.
So we're talking about Judges 19, and I'm going through a Bible study program where you read 10 chapters a day, but the chapters are from different books. I told you about this, and usually I go in order and go from, if it's Luke, then it's Ecclesiastes, then Corinthians. But when I stumbled upon chapter 19 of Judges, I'm like, oh, I need to read ahead. And it's the next three chapters. Some have called Judges 19 through 21 like the most gruesome story in the entire Bible. A lot of people question why is it even in the Bible? Like, it's so atrocious. It makes you feel very uncomfortable, especially reading it, right? This is one of the stories that you will never hear about in Sunday school.
Yeah, probably something that you probably wouldn't read to your kid before bed.
Definitely not, right? Of Judges is the last portion of the book of Judges, right? Judges starts with the death of Caleb and his son becoming the first judge, and it ends with there was no king in the land of Israel, and everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. And then it continues on to Samuel and eventually the development of a kingdom of Israel. But Judges 19 through 21 captures a horrific event that started with a sin of idolatry, and ended in an actual civil war, the first civil war Israel ever had in regards to the New Promised Land. And so the story goes like this. There's a Levite, and Levites lived amongst the entire nation of Israel. Because they didn't have an appointed lot of land to them, Levites were in every single region of the New Promised Land. That's how God appointed them, because they were designated to worship and be in charge of worship. And so this particular Levite was, I believe, from the hill country of Ephraim and Bethlehem. Bethlehem, obviously, the town where David was born, the town where Jesus came from. And so he had a concubine, and this story is essentially entitled "The Levite and His Concubine." Note that it's not his wife. Back in the time of Israel, concubines had much less rights than wives, right? There was no legal... think about it this way. In the modern day, we have a crisis in marriage, and a lot of red pill, hardcore Republican guys are like, well, I'm not going to get married because in 2 years my wife is going to divorce me and take 50% of my income, and I want to protect myself from that because I'm a future millionaire, or some kind of story like that. And so there are all these cohabiting relationships where people don't get married and they just kind of live together.
Yeah, there's a ton of examples of Abraham having it, like David, but I think we could significantly see that God never blessed those kind of marriages.
Yeah, because
he never talked positively about them.
Because marriage was supposed to be two becoming one, and in this sense, yes, they were technically married, but there weren't much protections for her, and so she ends up committing adultery, which is the beginning of the story. That's what sparks the story. She cheats on him and runs away to his father's house, and so he pursues her and talks nicely to her and tries to get her back. And there is this interesting, almost annoying storyline where they stay at his father's house, and the next day they want to leave, and the father makes them stay and have food and enjoy the day, and so it's too late to leave, and that happens over and over till the fifth day. And when I'm reading it, it seems so weird and bizarre and kind of annoying. If that was me in his shoes, I'd be just want to go. But I believe that's there to contrast the fact that this father was so hospitable to them, in a contrast of what's going to happen just the evening after. And so they reach a city called Geba, and Geba, or Gibeah, right? I don't know how people pronounce it, is essentially a city located in Benjamin's territory. The clan of Benjamin occupied this territory. And
that was... Notice one thing is that... They decided to go to a place of Israel, right? Instead of the land of pagans. It was almost supposed to be a better thing, but it turned out to be worse, ironically.
So there's a city called Jebus, which is essentially Jerusalem, and they avoided it purposefully,
Yeah.
knowing that their kindred, their brothers, would take care of them better than the people who they were supposed to conquer and
Yeah.
kick out of the promised land.
The godless people.
And here's the irony, though, right?
Yeah.
They would have not encountered the scenario they're coming to encounter. In other words, God is showing in this narrative that not only were they evil, but they were just as bad, or if not worse, than the surrounding nations around them.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you could say they were worse because of the circumstances that occur right afterward, right? They come to Gibeah. No one takes them in. Again, the contrast of hospitality, where the father makes them stay 5 days, right? He welcomes them, and the contrast is they're left in the city square. Now, I believe it was pretty common for people to just, show up, and if there's no inns or if there's no place they can stay, they'll just stay in the city street. It's safer than staying out in the field somewhere, right? But there's a man who actually doesn't live there. He's just a traveler as well, an old man who invites them in and begs them not to stay in the city's square, almost like prefacing that something wicked would come of them if they do. Mm-hmm. And essentially, this is a rhyme of history. A lot of people say history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. This is a rhyme repeated right in the line of Sodom and Gomorrah. Recognize the similarities. One, there are strangers who come into a land. The person who invites them into the home is himself not from the land where they come, right? The old man is not from that town. He's a stranger. So, two, there is a crowd of people that gather around the town. The building, the house where they stay, and the desire of the crowd is to essentially sodomize the Levite. Now, again, referencing back to Sodom and Gomorrah, these were people who wanted to rape the two angels that came to Lot's house. And because God was planning to destroy the cities, the angels blinded the people. They got wearied out of trying to grasp for the door, and they were able to leave the city. And in this case, it's what happens when God does not intervene.
Yeah.
The people gather in a fuss and fury, trying to yell and, get the Levite to come out. The old man refuses and says, "Here is my daughter and his concubine. Take them and do with them what you will, and leave him alone." Right? And then there's a lot of criticism that goes around in that particular point of the story because, well, what are they to do? Right? Some people say it's the choosing of between lesser of two evils. Some people say they should have been men and protected them until death. Right? But the reality was that that's what they chose to do. And instead of the daughter and the concubine, the Levite grabs the concubine and lets them have her. And essentially they abuse her, rape her all night. And then she is found dead in the morning at the threshold of the house. In other words, if you look back at Sodom and Gomorrah, God literally wiped out to the foundation of the city the people that did that. And here we see an ominous prediction of what's going to happen with the Benjamites. Noting also that these are not some kind of pagan or some kind of evil people that never knew the Lord, their God.
And Sodom and Gomorrah was?
Sodom and Gomorrah are the baseline for evil cities, right? If you want to determine how evil someone or some city is, you'd be like, well, are they as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah? And in this case, Gibeah actually was just as bad, but more so because they knew the law of God. They've experienced their forefathers experienced the Red Sea parting. They've experienced the water coming out of a rock. They've experienced the manna falling from heaven, and they knew God's law.
Yeah.
And in fact, this guy was a Levite, someone who represented God himself. And so there is this, there's multiple meanings layered on top of each other, right? It's a Levite who's come to the city, and they rape his concubine. And so that just shows that there's nothing holy left in Israel. There's no reverence for God, no recognition of his law. It is the full animalistic debauchery that can only come from people whose hearts have become purely overcome with desire and lust. And so the story begins with adultery and ends with essentially the death of almost 100,000, probably 80,000 people, plus or minus. And after they find her, the Levite picks her up, carries her to his home, and he takes a knife and he cuts her into 12 pieces and distributes those 12 pieces amongst the 12 tribes of Israel in the hope and the expectation that everyone will be so flustered and enraged that they would gather to discuss what to do next with Benjamin. Because this was not only a crime that was committed against one person, but essentially it was the final straw that broke in regards to the depravity of Israel, right?
Yeah, because you read all through Judges, and this story is towards, kind of towards the end of Judges, and it's kind of a climax.
It's how bad they can get.
Yeah, and it's like you see every single other example, like up to Judges, like, oh yeah, Gideon, he seemed good at first, but then later on, he fails, and then you get
worships other gods, and his kids all become corrupt.
You get other judges, and then you eventually get to like Samson, who's like, all right, he doesn't even start out good. He's bad from the start.
He sleeps with prostitutes. He kills people. He breaks the laws of God by eating unclean things. He does not listen to his parents in regards to marriage. He is the only thing that Samson has going for him is he does not cut his hair up to a point. That's the only obedience he has. And then after that, God obviously restores him and he kills everyone in a self-suicide.
Yeah, and I think this verse kind of, is repeated throughout Judges, and it's the very last verse in Judges, right? Chapter 21, verse 25. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes." That's kind of the theme, like, because they have forsaken God as their king, and because this pretty much leads to everyone doing their own thing.
Yeah, and not only that, but the way they go about punishing Benjamin is essentially genocidal. They gather about 400,000 men. All of Israel essentially gathers against Benjamin, and they select a certain group of people, and they go to battle. And the fascinating thing is they incline of the Lord if they should go about to battle against Benjamin. And the first
is Benjamin the city.
Giba's
in it.
Yeah, Giba's in the land, the allotted land of Benjamin.
Yeah.
And so when they're going against Giba, they're essentially going against the tribe of Benjamin.
Mm.
And they first request that the men who perpetrated this and the elders would be given to them in order they may be judged properly, but Giba refuses that, and so Benjamin summons their men to war, and Israel summons the 11 tribes that are left over to war.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, like the odds are incredible. I believe Benjamin only had like 26,000 men versus the 400,000 that Israel had. And obviously they didn't go to war with all of the 400,000, but the first battle occurs and 22,000 Israel men die. And this is after the Lord tells them to go. And it happens again. They come back and they inquire of the Lord and they go to war again. And the second day, 18,000 men die. And so there is this judgment that occurs where no one's safe. Israel gets punished by the decimation of 40,000 men, and Benjamin, against all hope, is still holding out. But the very next day, they plead and offer sacrifices to God again. And in this time, God says, "Go forth, and I will deliver them into your hand." And then they set up a strategic position where they have people who are set aside to ambush. Israel goes against Giba and Benjamin. Benjamin is lured out. Then the city is infiltrated, it starts burning. Benjaminites turn around, Israel pursues, and pretty much wipes out almost all of Benjamin. About 25,000 men, not including women and children.
Yeah.
Essentially, Benjamin is decimated to the point of genocide. There was almost no men left, except for 600. So out of, when I say what, if you double the population, let's say there's 25 or 26,000 men, 26,000 women plus 3,000, like 60,000 out of 60,000 people, 600 are left.
Yeah. And it says that they keep on asking the Lord, like, what should we do? So we go against our brothers. And the Lord keeps saying, go up for tomorrow, give them into your hand. So God ultimately wanted this to be a punishment, right, on Benjamin?
Yeah, but no, I don't think just on Benjamin. This isn't just another culmination of the punishment that Israel deserves, right? Prior to this, God punished them through other neighboring nations like the Amalekites,
Like
Amorites, and the Philistines coming and raiding them and putting them under having to pay tribute and all these scrimmages. But this time, God punishes Israel through civil war, and this is again the fact that this starts with idolatry of a woman and
adultery.
A man, like adultery, right? This signifies the fact that God has been rejected, and Israel goes whoring after all the other idols of the land. And the problem here is no one thinks it's a big deal or a bad idea. And that's the culmination of the verse here, right? Everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel, no king at all, and so they rejected God's standard, God's law, and the escalation always, accumulated to the fact where thousands and hundreds of thousands of people died. In all the judges, you see the constant overtaking, the constant oppression of Israel. And the reason they're being oppressed is because they're worshiping false gods. And after the decimation, the almost genocide of Benjamin with 600 people left, again, the punishment that God deals out to Benjamin was not God's idea, right? It's Israel who it's the Levi who chops up the 12 pieces, and it's Israel who goes to war against Benjamin. This was not decreed by God, but this is the punishment of God on a people who reject Him. There is no right or wrong in this case, right? They're just going by the seat of the pants. Yeah. That's the punishment that they deal out because they don't have a standard. This is not according to God's standard, but there is no standard anymore. Mm-hmm. And so after that, they recognize that Benjamin will in fact be cut off. Yeah. There will no longer be 12 tribes. There'll only be 11. And they create this weird and elaborate plan. And this shows you the uniqueness of Israel, where they hold to a oath that they made to themselves, and they don't want to be cursed. And the oath was that none of them would give any daughters to marry Benjamin. None of them would give wives to Benjamin. And so there's this issue. There's 600 men left. No women that can be given to them from Israel, and they have to marry within Israel. And so the clan of Benjamin was just going to die out. And so to go around this weird oath that they will keep, even though they don't keep God's law and God's standards and they worship false gods, this oath they do decide to keep. And they go in a roundabout way by saying, we won't give you the wives, but during this feast you can go and kidnap them yourselves, and therefore we're not culpable in giving them. And then when people ask, we'll say, well, we can't really take them, so it'll be a roundabout way where we get to keep our oath, and you can repopulate Benjamin.
Yeah.
And so, like, if you look through this story, there's adultery, there's sodomy, there's rape, there's murder, there's debauchery, there's kidnapping, and the story doesn't conclude in any pleasant sense. There's no goodness in the end of the story. The judgment that Israel incurs is bad. Like, there is no both the judgment on Israel and Benjamin. Like, if you were going to view the story in a way where you would find it satisfying and be like, oh,
You're like, where's the good guy?
Yeah, where is the good guy? And if Israel's the good guy, and so they war against Benjamin, and from the first battle they just subdue him, and there's no more issues with them. No, God twice has almost 20,000 people annihilated from Israel before they even scratch Benjamin, and so it's a tragedy. There's just pain, suffering, and the judgment and the repercussion of, decades of whoring after false gods.
Yeah. So, would you say in Judges there is no good guys, really?
There are good guys. But in this story, it is the recognition that when we decide to go to we want to be our own gods, right? The promise of Satan to Eve, and your eyes will be open and you will know good from evil. Or in other words, you will decide what is good and evil. And you will be like God, knowing good and evil. That promise... when people start living that way, there is a quick degeneration into pure animalistic desires, right? Like sodomy, the actual, like the word sodomy refers to, and we know it today, right? From 6,000 years ago, we know that word still today, and it references the worst possible thing that you can occur is to rape and abuse a foreigner that comes to your town in seeking a shelter. Meaning, that's how,
Through homosexuality.
Yeah. And so, what God is saying is, Israel had fallen past the level of Sodom and Gomorrah at this point. And what did God do to Sodom and Gomorrah? He rained brimstone and hellfire upon them. He wiped them out. Right? There was nothing left of them, not even the foundations.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about how this story kind of is surrounded by other examples of like leaders throughout Judges?
Yeah.
Because, right, we have all these other leaders, like Samson, who God used, like when we're talking about good guys. Like this story has no good guys. Like
none at all.
They're like 19 to the end.
If you read the book of Judges, to your point, the good guys get progressively worse.
Yeah.
Like first we have good guys that actually accomplish God's will, and they are faithful to Him, and then slowly it gets worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point where there is no judge. There is no one that could uphold the standard of God because the standard of God has been forgotten. The law of God has been rejected.
Yeah. Because you have like, Deborah, not Barack.
Barack, yeah.
Yeah, Barack. Obama.
It's either Barack or Brock, right?
And then, Gideon, who was decent, but he ended not too well.
Well, yeah, toward the end, he went back to the ways of worshiping false gods.
Jephthah. How did he do?
He did pretty well. Well, he kind of... I believe he's the one who promised his daughter to be sacrificed. Is that correct? Was that him?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so, when some people say it was just to sacrifice her virginity, which is fine, but still, he wasn't very in the sphere of, knowing God's law. And then after that, Samson, right?
Yeah.
And Samson is essentially a big buff guy who sleeps with prostitutes and kills people. That's the form in which he takes of judging. I did mention this before on the phone with you. Like, if you look at all the judges, almost none of them would qualify to be elders of the church today, right? The characteristics that they have and the who they are as imperfect human beings, they are far from perfect.
Do you think that's because they have they had a different standard? God had a different standard in the Old Testament, or just it was the same standard? It's just they were
bad.
Yeah. Do you think it's different now that we have the Holy Spirit?
I think Christians are different in some instances, but also Christians are capable of grave sin and very deep wickedness. That does not mean that they are forsaken by God, but there is a need for repentance. Like in Samson's case, he recognizes that he had sinned against God, and he asks God to restore his strength one last time. The Old Testament is not far from where we live today. We clearly sacrifice babies in the altar of Moloch, right? We butcher and destroy unborn human beings to the point where it is not only tolerated but celebrated.
Yeah.
We
we have different gods that we celebrate.
Yeah,
it's not a physical statue, but our gods are career and living our own,
the pride flag.
Yeah.
Right, and so we have the embrace and celebration of sodomy in the United States. We have the celebration of wickedness, and our leadership and federal government is corrupt, and so they do not practice justice. And so you see the degradation of people who just 100 years ago had the Word of God in awe and respect, rejecting it, have denigrated it, and have become an immoral people who hate life and love. I mean, who was it? I think someone mentioned I don't even know. Was it the Grammys or something? Some guy dressed up like the devil and danced around. I didn't even know about it until someone texted. I think I saw a Babylon Bee meme about it. I think it was like Satan wants to distance himself from the Grammys because they're so bad. But it is the worship, and again, the postmodern age has brought in people who think that they can define the truth, that they can self-reference for what is good and what is bad, and that's what the judges did. They forsook God's law and propped up their own standard, and that resulted in the genocide of almost an entire tribe, the decimation of almost 100,000 people, and the result in, the way they solved an issue with vows. They just said, hey, go kidnap and force yourselves upon women.
Yeah. You think on the bigger scale, like, where does Judges fit within the Bible? Because, right, like some atheists like to point out, like, if you just read this story, like, why is this even in the Bible? Why is this despicable thing? Like, the concept of rape, is like conjured up in the Bible. It's like, is this like, I thought the Bible was supposed to give good examples on how to get to heaven.
Well, the beautiful thing about the Bible, one reason we hold that it's true, is because it characterizes and it points out the flaws in its characters. God shows clearly that, if the Bible was written by people who wanted to be portrayed in it well, then people would write only the good things that they've done, all the great heroic deeds they've accomplished. And we kind of know the Bible is true, and one essence of that is the Bible writes about the horrible things that its characters did. And this is the pit in which the people of Israel found themselves without God. And the beginning of Samuel, the very next book, is the slow rebuilding of God's law and God's justice being applied to Israel.
Yeah.
Right? It's the rebuilding that led up to Saul and eventually David. And David is the father, and he is the essentially the giver of life to Jesus, whose throne will never be overthrown. He will be the King of Kings, and he, in fact, like, it might sound cheesy and very like people use this rhetoric, right? Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament kings, and he is. And when Judges says there was no king, there was a king. In fact, there was no king in Israel that they could see, but in fact, God, Jesus Christ, was the King of Israel. They just rejected his rule. And the rejection, it always equals like this. When you reject God's rule, you rule over yourselves, and you happen to be the most wicked thing on this earth. Your heart is deceitfully wicked, right? We human beings are. I think also another reason this is in the Bible is because a lot of people think that humans are basically good, and this book just disproves that to a T, to the period.
Yeah, to where even ungodly people would find this absolutely despicable.
Yeah, people say, well, morality is arbitrary. Not when you read Judges 19 through 21. Morality stops becoming arbitrary or subjective. It becomes real. And you recognize that, this story is worse than any Game of Thrones TV show that's out there today, right? It's awful. It's heart-wrenching. It's disgusting to read. And yet God uses it to portray what it looks like to separate yourself from the law of God.
Yeah, from Judges, there's like the next or the next part is like Ruth, isn't it?
Yeah,
And
I believe Ruth was
probably
at the period, like during the period of the Judges. It's just like it's a zooming in into the period of the Judges.
Yeah.
And then the next chronological history is
Probably Samuel.
Eli, and then because Eli is Samuel's mentor, Samuel grows up. After Samuel, it's the appointing of an actual king, because Israel wanted a king, and God says, they have not rejected you, Samuel, they have rejected me. And it's not that Israel shouldn't have a king. It wasn't against God's law to have a king. It was against God's law to have a king in the order that the other nations around them had a king.
Yeah.
And so that results in Saul, who eventually is superseded by David.
Because we talked about this, and like we're looking at 1 Samuel in a Bible study, and how like there was a king that God was supposed to set up. David was going to be king, and Saul was before that, right?
Yes.
But the problem, like you just said, they wanted a king that would look like the other kings around them. Because in Deuteronomy we read that, no, it's good. God says, I will set up a king.
Yeah. So that was
but it was the wrong motives.
Definitely. And even if you read the beginning of Samuel, you could see the era of the Judges continuing, right? Like the transition between Judges and Samuel is 21, right? As Judges 21. Everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes, and that resulted in the Ark of the Covenant being overtaken and plundered as plunder from a battle from Israel, right? And both the sons of Eli die, and he hears about this, falls back on his neck, and it breaks it, and there's a grandson that's born to Eli, and as his mother is dying, he's named Ichabod, which means the glory of God has departed from Israel. In the same vein where...
Wait, where was that?
That's 1 Samuel, I mean, 2nd or 1 Samuel? The first 2 chapters? Ichabod? I'll pull it up right now. Essentially, during the capture of the Ark of the Covenant, it's Samuel chapter 4, actually, my bad.
So this whole time in Judges, they still had the Ark?
Yes. But again,
how was
their Levites were, abusing their concubines and living in ways that...
But it seems like things were worse in Judges than in Samuel.
It is I guess...
Like, why didn't the glory of the Lord depart then?
It did. The whole point was... So, right, in the last portion of chapter 4, it says, "Now when the daughter-in-law, wife of Phinehas, was pregnant, she gave birth, and when she heard the news the ark of the God was captured, and her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, a woman attended to her said to her, 'Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son.' But she did not answer or pay attention, and she named the child Ichabod, saying, 'The glory of God has departed from Israel,' because the ark of God had been captured, and because her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, 'The glory of God has departed from Israel, for the ark of the covenant has been captured.'" And obviously the ark is returned later on, but this just shows the state where people had rejected God's law, and so God rejected them. This is the falling of the curse that God mentions in the end of Deuteronomy, where he says, "If you disobey me, this is the curse that will fall upon you." And as soon as, like literally as soon as Caleb dies, who is the last, the last hold to the old guard of Moses and Joshua and Caleb, as soon as he dies, Caleb's son, he's the first judge. And Israel just jumps off a cliff into debauchery, which results in the Ark of the Covenant being captured and them installing a king.
Yeah. It was because people didn't have the standard of God's word, right?
Yeah, the law was completely disregarded.
Did what was right in their own eyes.
Yeah. I mean, I hope people learn from this. And read Judges 19 through 21. See what you think about it. Recognize the depth of the pain and the suffering that can occur when you reject God's law. When you say you want to determine what is good and bad for yourself. You will have marauding hordes of sodomites trying to destroy and rape every single foreigner. Not good. Not good at all.